Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar about aligning data centers with sustainability goals. Next slide, please. Here's a little overview of what we'll be covering today. We'll get started with a few introductions, do some level setting, talk about some important baseline considerations, and then we're going to dive into levers that local governments can use to protect or advance their climate goals while considering data centers. After that, we'll share a checklist that you can use to inform your conversations with developers and an overview of the new Great Lakes Data Center Resource Hub. Finally, we'll close with some space for your questions. We definitely want to have a great conversation. So I would encourage you to drop any questions you have in the Q&A tab of the Zoom platform throughout the presentation. If you don't see that right off the bat, hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen and click on the three dots tab that says More to find the section that says Q&A. We'll be monitoring that closely and keeping the questions you submitted in advance in mind as well. So thank you for your commitment to having a great discussion with us today. Next slide, please. The first introduction I'll make to you will be on behalf of the Great Plains Institute itself, or GPI. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit that works to accelerate the transition to net zero carbon emissions for the benefit of people, the economy, and the environment. I've put our vision, mission, and values up on the screen here, but I want to make sure that we focus in on the topic of today's webinar for as much of our time as possible. So if you have any questions about this, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk to you more. And next slide, please. That leads me to introducing myself so that you can get a hold of me. My name is Mackenzie Love. I'm a senior program manager, and I led the project that this team is a part of, that this webinar is a part of. And I'm joined by my team, which includes two experts from the GPI staff, Bridget William, Policy Coordinator, and Trista Treese, Senior Policy Manager. These two folks are just a wealth of insight and knowledge, and I'm very proud that they will be here presenting some of this content to you today, and pleased to be with them. So thank you both for your contributions to this work. Next slide, please. This project got started with a national survey of planners and sustainability staff, to which we received 235 responses that represented a large number of states and the District of Columbia, variety of subspecialties and where folks are within their career journeys. We're very pleased to have that broad brushstroke of representation. Unsurprisingly, the biggest barriers that they reported to doing climate work were lack of funding and lack of staff time or capacity. But there were several new things that we learned from the survey as well. One of the biggest of which was that they felt examples would be really beneficial to them doing this work, with the thinking that if language passes their planning commission, the planning commission of a peer community, it might also pass with their planning commission. And the same holds true for other types of examples as well, making them an indispensable resource. Next slide, please. We also asked them what topics they needed the most help on. And when we considered the list of topics paired with this desire for real world examples, we did three things. The first was to host a national cohort of communities that explored climate and energy affordability using zoning as a tool to do that work. To accomplish the other two things, we worked with an advisory group of communities, peer organizations, and industry leaders to create two playbooks, one about autonomous vehicles and one about data centers, that again help to provide those real world examples and replicable best practices for communities that are aiming to protect or advance their climate goals while considering these technologies. We have had webinars about each of these topics, including the conversation today, and we're so thrilled that you've joined us to talk about data centers and would like to offer you recordings of the other two webinars as well. So we'll have links to those in the end of today's slide deck. Next slide, please. With that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Bridget Williams, who will help us with some level setting. Thank you so much, Bridget.
Yeah, thanks, Mackenzie. So to start us off, let's talk about what we're talking about when we talk about data centers throughout this presentation and in our playbook. So data centers house servers and other computing equipment to store and process data, deploy internet services, and support other large-scale computing needs. Data centers are not new uses. Many communities are familiar with hosting small to medium-sized data centers. However, large-scale data centers are increasingly proposed in communities due to growth in cloud computing and artificial intelligence. When we talk about large-scale data centers, There's no across the board definition for what a large scale data center is. For GPI, our minimum criteria is do they use a peak electricity usage of 20 megawatts? The reason that that is our minimum criteria is because at 20 megawatts, that's when facilities can trigger a need for larger electric grid upgrades, new transmission lines, new substations, et cetera. The other minimum criteria for a large-scale data center is it at least 10,000 square feet? As you can see off to the side here, large-scale data centers are increasingly much larger than these minimum criteria. There have been several proposed that are upwards of 1 gigawatt of electricity. That's equivalent to the annual consumption of 1 million households. It's also roughly equivalent to the capacity of an average nuclear plant. These facilities are also exceeding 1,000 acres in size. This is roughly equivalent to 245 average Walmart supercenters. So these can be quite large facilities. The types of large-scale data centers are large co-location facilities. So co-location facilities can be small, medium, or large. Co-location facilities are ones where one company owns and operates the facility and leases the computing power to several tenants. The electricity usage of these facilities, large-scale ones, are 20 megawatts and above. Their average size is 11,000 square feet, though this is an older number and is likely to change as more and more larger facilities are developed. Examples of these are QTS and Equinix, are both large-scale co-location developers. The other type of large-scale data center is a hyperscale facility. These facilities are dedicated to artificial intelligence and cloud computing. They have an electricity usage of 100 megawatts and above. Their average size is 30,000 square feet per module. So these facilities are typically developed in phases and will surpass this 30,000 square feet threshold. Examples of this are Meta, Google, OpenAI, Oracle, Microsoft, etc. So why is this important for local governments? Local governments are interested in these facilities and concerned about these facilities for a variety of reasons. Their electricity usage, their water impacts, air quality impacts, their heat, their sheer size that can affect the surrounding land use of the area where they are sited, whether the concern is around agricultural preservation or preserving residential areas, etc. Noise, fire and safety, economic and workforce development, the lighting and visual impacts of the facilities, how do they impact traffic, and what is the electronic waste associated with these facilities. We are really going to focus on the electricity impacts and how their electricity usage really feeds into a lot of other impacts, but we'll touch on some of these other community priorities throughout the presentation, and we touch on them throughout the playbook. So data centers are expected to consume as high as 580 terawatt hours of US electricity in 2028. This is equivalent to roughly half of today's US industrial electricity use. So this is what makes data centers really unique and why they are a really important topical area for Great Plains Institute and others that are focused on sustainability. This electricity usage has a few impacts for communities. First, many local governments have sustainability plans or energy plans that include energy efficiency targets, vehicle electrification targets, and these plans did not account for the electricity usage associated with data center growth. Electricity usage may pose several conflicts for communities. A few examples here are number one, fossil fuel deployment. So developers are trying to get these facilities connected to the grid and built as fast as possible. And because of this, utilities have delayed gas and coal retirements. And developers are investing in new generation that can be built quickly to power facilities. Natural gas and solar are really both generation resources that take a short amount of time to build, an average of 5 years. But solar alone is less viable to support these facilities because storage is not as commercially deployable. And so natural gas seems more viable to support these 24/7 operations. To give you a sense of the difference in construction timelines, a data center can go up within a few years. Wind facilities take an average of 10 years to build. Associated transmission infrastructure, those high voltage power lines, can take an average of 10 years to build. So generation resources that can allow facilities to power quickly are really attractive to utilities and to data center developers. In addition, due to these electricity usage needs, many facilities rely on backup generators to meet 24/7 power needs, which are often diesel or natural gas powered. And there's also a water use associated with electricity usage. So associated power generation, natural gas plants, nuclear facilities, facilities that rely on water for their cooling needs. This accounts for approximately 75% of data centers' water usage in the United States. So it's really that offsite water usage associated with the power generation that is really contributing to the water footprint of facilities rather than this on-site cooling that you often hear about and that we'll touch on throughout this presentation. So, a few considerations before a local government reviews a data center proposal or updates its policies. Number one, local governments really have to look at their state policy environment, what types of preemptions might be in place at their state level, what is the state permitting process for air quality permits, water permits, other permits that might affect data centers, and what are specific data center policies at the state level that may impact the how fast data centers are developing in their communities, that determine how communities can tax data center facilities, etc. Other considerations are local burdens. So data centers can impact different communities differently. So if there are already historical burdens in an area, if there's already a history of polluting facilities or air quality concerns, if it's a rural community that has already had a lot of energy infrastructure and generation resources built in the area, a new data center being proposed in that community is going to feel very different than in some other communities that have not had that level of development. Other considerations is risk of stranded assets. Is the AI bubble likely to pop and these facilities are not needed at the scale that they're currently growing? Communities really have to consider the trade-offs of these facilities. What are the economic development benefits of these facilities versus the impacts to the community, electricity or water impacts, etc. Communities have to consider access to information. Developers may use third-party companies to propose these facilities, and it can be unclear to the community who will actually operate the facility. A lot of information about data centers, like how much electricity, well, less how much electricity they use, but how much water they use, their type of cooling method, the particular of these facilities can be considered trade secret, and it can be difficult for local governments to access that information. There has been a history of data center developers asking local officials to sign non-disclosure agreements, which can make it difficult to share information with the public. So that is also a big consideration for communities. And lastly, how do these facilities align with community priorities? We'll talk a little bit about ensuring that any policies that are set by a local government are in line with their comprehensive plan and other plans within the community, and that a community is really considering, should we establish a moratorium, a temporary moratorium before we allow data centers to make sure we get our policies right? How do these facilities align with or conflict with our community priorities? And I'll hand it over to Mackenzie to talk about our first lever of influence.
Thanks, Bridget. That's really helpful background. And if you could take us to the next slide, I'll get us into our first lever that local governments can use when considering data centers. One of the most foundational items in any local government toolkit is its zoning ordinance. And this is true in the context of data centers as well, because no matter how large the site, no matter how powerful the developer or the extent to which a project is part of a larger, say, national, sometimes international strategy, it will be built on local land in local contexts and impact local people. And for that reason, a local government has a critical role to play, and their ability to regulate development through zoning can be a great way to act on it. The mandate for local government action of this type really should come from the people. And for that reason, we encourage zoning ordinances to be coordinated closely with community visions and plans, such as your comprehensive plan that Bridget mentioned earlier. You could take us to the next slide, please. We have some steps for you to update both your zoning ordinance and a variety of different types of plans. It could be comp plans, climate action plans, small area plans, etc. But update them in concert with one another to prepare for data centers. The first is to define the types of data centers that you'll be talking about. And Bridget did a great job of giving you some examples of what those definitions could look like earlier, and they're also recorded in the playbook that we'll be sharing later. The point here is to minimize any sort of potential confusion sources for developers so that everybody is starting from a similar place of understanding when you kick off negotiations or other types of consideration. I do want to make an additional point here that, especially in zoning ordinances, silence on a land use, such as a data center, can often be interpreted as prohibition of that land use, but not always. So it's really important for local governments to understand how zoning ordinances are interpreted in their context, especially when you're thinking about setting clear definitions that will be the foundation for other work. The next step is to explore trends. Planning activities such as completing a comprehensive plan or other type of plan can often be used as a tool to analyze if a community may or may not be attractive to a data center developer. And then subsections of those plans, such as chapters on sustainability or economic development, can be used to understand the potential impacts of developments based on existing trends in the field. So you could look to peer communities and extrapolate how it would meet your context. And your plans can be a good vehicle to do that. Through all of this, you do want to ensure alignment with your community vision. And there are things that you can do directly in your zoning ordinance to that end. For example, you could require transitional land uses between data centers and residential zones. This can help with noise management, aesthetics, heat impacts, a variety of things. You can set that out in code. But ultimately, the most effective thing that you can do to assure alignment with those visions that have already been established is to require discretionary review of the development proposals as opposed to by right or administrative approval to make sure that you're moving forward in the same direction as the vision that you've already laid out. All of these tools can be used to limit, encourage, or guide implementation of data centers. And there are many examples of this across the country. We've highlighted a number of them in our playbook, and we took care to make sure that we brought examples of small communities, large communities, different geographic locations, different median incomes, population size, et cetera, so that you can see kind of the range of what is possible in the real world and what's already been done successfully. I'll have a couple of examples for you on the next slide, but I just want to highlight that planning for data center development is very nuanced, as we're starting to allude to here, and it's important to have plans and regulations in place proactively. And it is equally important to have the right folks involved in making those plans and regulations. So we recommend involving members of your community first and foremost, but also considering local sustainability offices, economic development offices, and utility providers and other similar organizations as you're thinking about any changes to your zoning ordinance or other planning activities. Next slide, please. These are some of the community examples I promised you, and there are more in the playbook. The one on the left side of your screen here is Monticello, Minnesota, which is quite a small community, and they've used a combination of comprehensive planning and zoning together to limit data centers to light industrial park zones. On the right side of your screen, you'll see Prince William County, Virginia, which is a very large community, and they have created a data center opportunity zone overlay district that was designed to encourage the development of data centers in their jurisdiction, kind of giving you some ideas of the range of possibilities here. If you'll go into the next slide, I'll talk about our second lever, which is written agreements. And there are a variety of options here, but all of them can be effective ways to further guide the development of data centers and continue to maximize that alignment with your community vision. Now, as I said earlier, there are many types of agreements, and your local government should make sure that you understand what is applicable to your context and legally enforceable before you pursue one of these. I'm going to give you two illustrative examples of the types of agreements that are out there for your initial reference, but there's more in the playbook if you want more detail. The first is development agreements, also known as DAs, and these are made between the developer and the local government itself. DAs can cover a wide variety of topics, but it is critical that there be what's known as a rational nexus between what's asked of the developer and the impacts of the project. So, for example, it might make sense to use a DA to ask a data center developer to do something that would help manage water usage, but it might not make sense to try to use the DA to get them to build a bridge. Now, again, that's context specific, but just an example. The second type of agreement I'll highlight is called community benefit agreements, or CBAs. And these are made between the developer and often a community organization of some type, although in some states, local governments can enter into these agreements as well. Again, it's important to understand what's applicable to you in your context. And if you're not sure what's legally enforceable for you, we'd encourage you to reach out to your municipal league or county association to better understand what is available. On the next slide, I'll go into a little bit more detail. I'll note that written agreements can be used for a variety of purposes. They can require investments in local infrastructures, ask for contributions to funds that support energy assistance programs for your community members to keep those monthly costs manageable for them. They can be used to support workforce development programs or training and to ensure transparency through reporting about who owns the data center and perhaps also some of its resource usage. Once again, we're going to encourage local governments to ensure that the right folks are at the table here early, right from the beginning. You might want to consider reaching out to community benefit organizations or CBOs, workforce development organizations, public utilities, watershed districts, and the like. On the next slide here, I'll go over a couple of community examples. The first is Mesa, Arizona, which used a DA or development agreement to encourage their data center developers to prioritize using non-potable water for their cooling systems to minimize the impact on the municipal water supply. That's a really great example. And on the right, I have Prince William County, Virginia here for you again. And the reason they're showing up again is because they use something slightly different called proffers, very similar to a development agreement, but I just wanted to show you the variety of types of written agreements that are available to you. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, proffers can be used for several different purposes, and Prince William has found this to be a useful tool in mitigating the impacts from noise, providing some buffers between data centers and residences, and putting some requirements around site design that were important to their community members. So you can see how these different agreements can take a variety of forms and cover a huge range of topics. And with that, I will hand it back over to Bridget, who will take us through our next couple of levers.
So our third lever that we're going to talk about are impact studies. Impact studies can be used to assess the expected impacts of a proposed development on local conditions. So, you know, while local governments may have a sense of what the impacts of a facility might be based off of its size, based off of who's operating the facility, different facilities can have different impacts depending on the condition of the local watershed, for example, depending on the neighborhood that it is sited in and the surrounding uses, depending on the types of taxation authorities that the local government has, depending on how likely it is that the facility is going to update its computing infrastructure and machinery. So there's a lot of factors that rely on understanding the impacts of a unique facility to really understand its impacts. By using an impact study to assess the impacts of a proposed development, a local government can evaluate the costs and benefits. So that gets to what Mackenzie was talking about making sure that you're hitting that rational nexus and that anything that you're requesting from the development in a community benefit agreement, for example, matches the impacts of the facility. You can determine the impact fees using the results of an impact study or recommend proposal modifications. So there are a few opportunities to use impact studies. First is to require or encourage impact studies as well as regular monitoring of impacts in a zoning ordinance. The second is to uh, include an impact study in a project agreement. So asking the developer to contribute a certain amount of money to have a third party conduct an impact study as part of a community benefit agreement, for example. Considerations when determining what will be part of an impact study is an impact study can cover a variety of topics. You might look at the air quality impacts of a facility, the noise impacts, fiscal, water, local demographics and existing pollutants should be factored into an impact study that's focusing on air quality or water quality. The impact study should be conducted by an independent third party, an engineering firm or academic institution. An impact study should be paired with regular monitoring of impacts if the facility is built. So it's one thing to look at a facility and assess what are the impacts of this facility on local ozone or other air quality impacts. But it's another, once the facility is built, to continually monitor the impacts of that facility and make sure that the facility is in line with what the impact study said. So a few examples of this. First is Lynn County, Iowa. In Lynn County, Google agreed to fund a $500,000 water balance study for a proposed data center to assess potential impacts to long-term water availability in the county. This water balance study did not commit Lynn County to approving the facility. The study was ultimately not conducted because there's a little bit of an interesting history with Lynn County. So Google had been in negotiations with the county. They had talked about this water balance study. Lynn County ultimately passed a zoning ordinance that required future projects, as well as if this Google project had continued to go through the process, to do a few things, have fund a water balance study, to include community benefits, to have certain open confidentiality requirements. There were a lot of things within the zoning ordinance that passed. Google ultimately proposed to annex the land into a neighboring jurisdiction of Palo, and now there's sort of negotiations occurring between the city of Palo, the Google data center, and Lynn County. But through this early negotiation process with Google, where they talked about this water balance study and where Lynn County passed this zoning ordinance, that has really influenced Palo as well. And Palo has now passed its own zoning code that widely matches Lynn County's. So they really set the stage to have this conversation. Even if this water balance study doesn't go through, future projects will have to conduct a water balance study. And it definitely set the tone for what communities are requiring or asking for from Google. Second example is Atlanta, Georgia. In their zoning ordinance, they require a transmission line impact assessment through which data center developers must identify potential electric transmission needs and associated environmental impacts to public land from those transmission needs. So requires all data center developers to provide information about what the energy infrastructure impacts of new facilities will be. The last lever that we talk about is external coordination. Local governments can engage and coordinate with external partners to strengthen cooperation amongst neighboring communities and advocate for policies and programs at the utility, state, and regional levels that support local goals. I gave a little bit of background on the experience of Lynn County in passing their zoning ordinance. And in trying to get Google to fund a water balance study, there were conflicts between the two communities, between Lynn County and between the city of Palo. If those entities had maybe coordinated early on before there was an actual data center on the table, they maybe could have determined a few shared principles and coordinated rather than worked against each other at the start of this Google proposal. In addition, local governments can coordinate with their electric and water utilities to promote innovative partnerships and proactive planning. So, for example, Excel Energy and Google have a partnership in Minnesota to invest in clean energy, large-scale renewable projects, large-scale storage projects. An example of proactive planning is the Aurora Water in Colorado. They have a large water users guide where they really establish some key guidelines for large energy users in their area surrounding how they can use water and what process they have to follow. And the city of Aurora actually adopted what was in that large water user guide into their own code. Local governments can also engage with electric and water utilities to promote new rate classes for data centers to ensure that these large energy and water users are paying their fair share for the infrastructure required for these facilities. Local governments can also coordinate with state and regional decision makers. So this looks like the state lawmakers, a public utilities commission, which regulates the electric utilities. And local governments can do this in a variety of ways, participate in working groups. They can submit public comments. And then I mentioned how communities can coordinate with each other when you share a boundary, when you're part of the same utility territory. Communities within the same area can coordinate to form intergovernmental partnerships to foster shared learning and hopefully establish some shared principles so that they can work together rather than against each other when a facility comes to their community. A few examples of this: Dane County, Wisconsin. After a data center developer had proposed to annex land from one incorporated town into another, the county established an advisory committee on data centers to establish a shared understanding of data center impacts amongst the county, town, cities, and villages within the county, and members of the public. This advisory committee is ongoing, and they talk about a variety of topics. They will have third-party, independent, trusted people come in to talk about the fire and safety impacts, electricity usage impacts, workforce development impacts of data centers so that they can come to a shared understanding and create some recommendations for their policies going forward. Another example is Indianapolis, Indiana. The city submitted comments on its electric utilities integrated resource plan, where they recommended an expanded green tariff renewable option for large energy users. The change would create new opportunities and incentives for data center developers to produce renewable energy generation. Or to procure renewable energy generation. So this was an example of how the city of Indianapolis, they were already engaging their utility on other issues, and they had already planned to respond to this integrated resource planning process, and they incorporated data center concerns into those comments. So lastly, after the playbook goes through the 4 levers that communities can use to mitigate data center impacts, it includes a sample development review checklist. This covers questions that local governments can ask in the development review process within a variety of topics. So there are general questions, just making sure that the developer is getting the right state and federal permits that it needs to procure. There are questions surrounding water, electricity, air, land use, as well as community impacts. So covering fire and safety, noise, community benefits, etc. The checklist is quite long, so I thought I would just include a sample here. These are the types of water questions that we ask that we provide that can really help local governments get a sense of what the water impacts of a facility might be. So communities should ask both, what is the projected on-site water usage of the facility? due to on-site cooling needs, but also what is the projected off-site water usage associated with the facility due to the electricity usage of that facility? What is the water usage impact of the proposed facility? This is sort of an emerging gold standard for data center water usage. Are there any water conservation measures planned? Is the developer willing to fund an impact study, like the example in Lynn County? Is the cooling system designed to utilize the community's surrounding climate to minimize water and energy usage? So, as an example, a data center that is located in Wisconsin, where I'm located, they can use the cooler winters and the cooler climate to support cooling the facility rather than using on-site water during those times or using electricity, a lot of electricity during those times to cool their facilities versus say that same facility in Arizona, they might need to use a much different cooling system. Will there be any private on-site wells built as part of the project? How will the developer promote early engagement and continuous coordination with the local water utility to mitigate impacts, making sure that there's proper water treatment capacity, that there is enough water supply? And what chemicals will the facility use for cooling methods? Will these chemicals be released back into the water system, and how will they be treated to ensure that there are not water quality impacts of the facility? So that's just an example of the types of questions a community might ask in the development review process. And these questions can also be very helpful in informing the levers that we just talked about, what kinds of things you might want in your zoning code or in a project agreement to mitigate these impacts. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Tricia.
Hi, everyone. So a lot of the advanced questions and some of the questions that we've been getting in the Q&A box touch on where can we find resources related to data center development and sustainability. And so something that GPI has built is a Great Lakes Data Center Resource Hub. So these are designed to help states and communities navigate energy, sustainability, affordability implications of data center development. It's a living, searchable collection of relevant tools, reports, and policy examples from across the country. And we have curated a list of these. There are tons of resources, and we continue to add some periodically as things come up and seem like a really good, neutral, just fact-based resource. And we're continuing to add examples as they show up in the world. And while this is called the Great Lakes Data Center Resource Hub, it's really the publications and the policy examples are from across the country. We also have connection to pro bono technical assistance for the Great Lakes region. Some of these technical assistance providers actually operate nationwide, and some of them are specific to certain states or geographies. And just looking at the time and wanting to make sure that we have time for questions, I'm not going to do a live demo. However, a few things I would like to point out. So there are 3 tabs: publications, policies, and pro bono technical assistance. Publications are going to be those resources that are produced by academics and other institutions to provide information. The policies tab is going to have examples from either state tariffs or comp plans or zoning ordinances, etc. And then, and some of these resources are actually compilations of other things. So, for example, there's a data center moratorium tracker on there. There are some various folks who are tracking data center announcements and have some GIS maps available. And as we come across these and we vet the resource, we are posting these to the hub. And then the last tab is pro bono technical assistance. So with that, I'd like to turn us over to Q&A, which I will also facilitate. So we have a few questions that I'm going to tee up to start. based on the advanced questions that you guys submitted to us. And then we'll get into live questions. As a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please hover over the More button. It's got like 3 little dots on it, and then click into the Q&A box and submit your question. Do we want to continue to share screen, or do we want to drop it for the Q&A? There we go. Okay. So the first question is, what best practices are local and county governments using in their general plans, zoning ordinances, or moratoriums to set reasonable boundaries for data centers?
Yeah, so as I think Mackenzie maybe noted at the start, data centers are an emerging topic, especially while states like Virginia and Texas and California have been getting data center proposals for a long time, and even large-scale facilities for the past few years. We're really only just starting to see communities start to integrate data center considerations into their comprehensive plan or create full comprehensive land use rules surrounding data centers. So examples are still quite new, and we're following a lot that are maybe will be passed, but are not yet finalized. But when we do, we have done a few zoning reviews for communities. And as we've been looking through some of these examples, there's a few key tenets of different types of zoning ordinances that we've seen. Does the local government establish clear land use standards but require discretionary review? I provided the example of Lynn County, Iowa earlier. They created an exclusionary zone. So they set very clear standards for data center facilities, but they require a rezoning for any facility that wants to go into the community, which requires a public hearing process and a larger review process from the community. We are looking to see if data centers are defined by size and or electricity usage. As we mentioned, small scale data centers, those impacts are very different from a large scale data center facility. So our local government's categorizing data centers by their electricity usage. And are they setting some clear standards for those larger facilities? Mitigating risk of stranded assets. We're starting to see more communities integrate requirements for decommissioning plans or other plans to return, maybe not the land use back to what it was before the facility located there, but at least to a state where it can be used by a different facility than the data center that was located there. Requiring or encouraging community benefit agreements. This is a challenging one because not communities in all states cannot require community benefit agreements. It really depends on the state that you're in. And even in states where it's allowed, it can be tricky for those project agreements to be enforceable. So we and other technical assistance providers are actually still trying to figure out what the best opportunities are there for local governments. Requiring backup generators to meet EPA Tier 4 emissions or equivalent standards to limit the air quality impacts. And then requiring or promoting energy efficiency and use of clean energy resources through building design. So actually a really interesting example of this that has not passed yet is the city of St. Louis in Missouri. They have a current draft zoning ordinance to require LEED certification as practicable, as well as green roof, cool roof, and or rooftop solar to prevent the heat impacts, mitigate the heat impacts of data centers. They also include a requirement that the facility needs to connect to its district heating network if it's close enough to do so. So that's a really innovative, interesting example that's out there right now. I'll stop there for a minute, but Mackenzie, do you have any other things to add?
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. That was so good. But I'll just add a couple of things that we're seeing come up for the first few times. Some community-driven concerns that have arisen around data centers recently have to do with noise and heat. And so those are areas that are still, as Bridget mentioned previously, looking for best guidances to kind of coalesce around. But things that we have seen take place already are limiting perceivable noise at the property line to address noise. So you could look at conducting a base level assessment in terms of decibel level that exists before the project, and then requiring no increase at the property line after it's implemented. And you can do something similar for heat, to just look at what the difference is at that property line. So that can be a way to have context specific engagement with the developer and set reasonable boundaries, is what's perceivable at the edge of your development.
Thank you for those very thoughtful answers. The next question, and this is another one that we pulled from the advanced questions, is how can local leaders maintain transparency and a social license to operate when addressing public concerns, non-disclosure agreements, and developer negotiations?
I can start on that one, Tricia, and then if you want to add. Yes, the idea of having social license to operate one of these facilities is really important. And what that means is having the trust of the community. And that is something that has to be earned over time and maintained, something that needs to be considered on an ongoing basis. So some ways that this can be done are engaging your community members in the process early and often, and being really transparent with your negotiations with developers, or perhaps your planning activities, and the reasoning for why those negotiations are taking the form that they are, so that folks feel like they understand what's happening and have ways to be engaged with it. Also encourage acting on any feedback that you get from those community members that you've involved, not only right at the onset of the project or in the planning stages, but also over time. This will be a part of their community fabric in an enduring way. On that same vein, you might want to establish recurring opportunities to take that feedback, and also to check in and encourage action from the developer themselves. You might want to think about encouraging a developer to make ongoing investments in the community or in specific programs rather than just a point in time. So maybe think of things like creating a fund for energy bill assistance, or requiring recurring contributions per megawatt hour to a community fund for some other purpose. So that kind of relationship and trust is not only built up front, but also maintained over time. I think that goes a long way to encouraging the kind of trust that is kind of foundational to having that social license that you mentioned.
And I'll just add that ensuring that the impacts of these facilities are transparent to the community is still an ongoing challenge. We're seeing there have been examples of data center developers, Microsoft, for example, saying that they will no longer use non-disclosure agreements when they propose developments in communities. And that is a really encouraging trend, because if a company like Microsoft does that, then that makes it a little easier for a local government in a negotiation with another developer to say, well, this larger company is no longer using non-disclosure agreements, so why do you have to? Taking a hard look at your non-disclosure agreement policy and culture across your community, and really determining, when is this necessary, who should sign it. Officials, really, there is not really a reason for local officials to be signing non-disclosure agreements, because once local officials sign a non-disclosure agreement, it really erodes trust with the larger community. And another example of that erosion of trust is when developers use third-party companies to propose these facilities, and it's unclear who the developer is going to be. An example of this is in Racine County. There are a few Microsoft developments that have been proposed and approved there, and Microsoft has been very clear that their plan is for a 15-facility development. However, Microsoft used a third-party company to propose a development, a third development within the community. And the community really did not like that lack of transparency. And ultimately, that project did not go through. And so communities have a really good reason to say, we actually really do need to know who the company is that's going to operate this, not only to build trust with our residents, but also because That information is very important for local governments to assess the impacts of a development. It's much easier to determine, okay, what are the impacts of this Google facility going to be if you can look at another Google facility in a nearby state. If you don't know who that developer is going to be, it's really hard to know what their practices are, what types of investments they might make in a community. So that's another key thing that communities should be pushing for.
Our next question is, we're learning a lot about impacts, water, air, and noise pollution, but what about other impacts such as the costs for the infrastructure, like water infrastructure usage impacts electric transmission lines, and also the more human noise impacts like lost sleep, social impacts, and more. Wondering if you've seen or if community benefits agreements can include these more comprehensive impacts.
Yeah, so when it comes to the assuming that your electric and water utilities are not municipal utilities and that these are investor-owned utilities, it can be very challenging for local governments to include um, requirements in their zoning code. Basically, like local governments just need to be careful that they are not getting into another jurisdiction's territory. So if a local government is requiring in their zoning code, a data center facility has to pay their fair share for the electric grid upgrades. That is not within the local government's authority typically. And so that's when the external coordination piece becomes very important, where the local government is engaging with their electric utility and their water utility staff to say, okay, what are if we're to have this much data center growth in the community, is it likely that that you can accommodate that? Can we plan for these things proactively rather than waiting facility by facility? So for a utility, for example, can you plan your distribution infrastructure in advance, understanding how much data center growth you're expecting to come online, rather than waiting facility by facility? I'm not sure if I answered that question super well there, but I don't know if you want to restate the question, Trisha.
I think that was a great response.
Okay.
Mackenzie, do you have anything to add?
I'll just add a little bit to address the question about community benefit agreements. Um, the community benefit agreements and development agreements depend on which is most appropriate for your context and which parties want to enter in, as I mentioned earlier. And it's laid out in the playbook, which we will be sharing with you all in the follow-up materials here. But they can address things like those additional cost areas that the person who posed the question offered. We've seen them range from everything about water usage to workforce development and more. We want to highlight that it is really important when you're thinking about setting up this type of agreement to think about how the impacts of these data centers might affect certain groups more than others, particularly folks who have already been marginalized. So I think it's really great to call out that there are more costs that might have a different type of impact than the utility usage that has become so prominent. I also wanted to note that if a development agreement or community benefit agreement doesn't work for you, there are other things that you can do, other types of written agreements that you can formalize. For example, in El Paso, Texas, there was a water supply agreement as part of negotiations between that locality and a developer, which also included things like hiring commitments for local workforce. So there are different ways to come at this. The point that I want to get across in answering this question is, yes, you can address those costs. Yes, they are real. Make sure to consider how the impacts might affect different segments of your population based on the past history of what's happened with those people.
And on the whole, the strongest avenue that a local government has to mitigate those costs is really the external coordination, because we all share the same water system, we all share the same electric grid, and there are much larger entities that plan these systems. And a local government can only do so much within its zoning code or through a project agreement to try to minimize those costs getting passed down to consumers. It really comes down to engaging your Public Utilities Commission. It really comes down to coordinating with your utility and data center developers to come up with innovative projects, like Mackenzie's noting. That's another way to try to fund maybe lower income electricity needs, energy efficiency upgrades, is if you can use those partnerships to develop some innovative programs in your community.
Thank you, Bridget and Mackenzie. One of the questions is, what is the scope of the pro bono TA? So I think that that's referring to the resource hub. And the hub itself has some descriptions of the services that are available. I think I'll just tee it up for Bridget and Mackenzie to just provide a very short answer of the kind of TA that we have been providing. But yeah, you can see that in the hub.
Yeah, so on our end, we have been, it's really challenging to create a playbook that is national in scope because of those state considerations. What one community can do, like I mentioned the example of St. Louis and some of the really innovative things they're doing in their zoning code. Those things are probably not going to be as possible in a state where there may be preemptions against the community that make it really difficult to make requirements around energy usage or building design. So state context is really, really important. So that's our hope of where we can come in, is that we can connect with communities to provide more individualized assistance if they are working in their zoning code and want us to do a review to check it against things that we've seen in the past and key tenants. That is something that we can do and have been doing for communities in the Midwest. We have been doing a lot of work in the Great Lakes states, providing assistance to local governments, whether it's answering questions about, what are about the impacts of data centers, or about looking for more research into their state code. We're working on a project to support cross-community coordination to develop some shared principles on data center development. And we are always providing education. So we're always doing speaking engagements, talking to a variety of interests, whether it be labor or water utilities or local governments. We are talking to basically anyone and everyone about the impacts to local governments and what levers local governments have available to them. So those are the types of technical assistance opportunities that we have available.
Thank you, Bridget. We are getting close to the end of the hour. There are more questions, and I have noted those down. But we'll transition back to the slides to end our webinar.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tricia, and thank you, Bridget, for all of your responses to those. And thank you, everyone who attended, for asking such thought-provoking questions. We'd love to continue the dialogue with you. So all of our contact information is in this slide deck, which we will be sending out as a follow-up to today's webinar. We also want to invite you to follow this entire project, which had the three components of exploring climate and energy affordability through zoning, autonomous vehicles, and data centers. So we are putting updates to key resources and a blog that we have about this project on the GPI website that you can access by scanning the QR code that I have on your screen right now. And we will also share that updated blog with all registrants for all of our webinars. It will include links to the recordings of the 3 webinars in this series, and links directly to the playbook that we talked about today, as well as a companion playbook on autonomous vehicles. And those playbooks will be available free of charge. And as Bridget noticed, they are nationally focused and have some broad brush stroke kind of guidance for you. But if you need something more specific, more context sensitive, please reach out to us. We're happy to talk at any time. I do anticipate that the playbooks will be published by Monday, so you can look forward to getting that information very soon. We appreciate you all joining us here today and look forward to continuing to talk to you. And I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks, everybody.